"Stop!" the broken seamstress whispered desperately as the weathered rancher hesitated at her doorstep, clutching secrets that could topple an empire built on lies. The townspeople saw her as nothing, a fallen woman crushed beneath impossible debts, destined to fade into silent servitude until death claimed her. They assumed the powerful banking family would grind her into dust like all the others before her. But the solitary rancher, haunted by his own violent past, recognized something in her trembling voice that reminded him why he'd traded his guns for solitude. What neither knew was that she possessed documents proving decades of systematic fraud, evidence that could free dozens of families or get them both killed. Her whispered plea wasn't just for help. It was the spark that would either ignite justice or consume them both. Would two broken souls find redemption together, or would speaking truth destroy the only safety they had left? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The needle pierced Monet Rivers' finger for the third time that morning. Blood dotted the white fabric she was mending in the cramped room above the general store. Outside, the Arizona Territory sun beat down on Crimson Hollow with merciless intensity. Inside, the heat felt worse. 16 hours a day she worked. Every stitch brought her closer to paying off her late husband's gambling debts. Every stitch reminded her that she once stood before children in a proper schoolhouse, teaching them to read and write and dream. Now she served at the pleasure of the Blackwood family, who owned her debt and her future. Adelaide Blackwood swept into the shop below. Her voice carried through the floorboards like poison through water. Monet set down her needle. Mrs. Blackwood expected immediate attention when she arrived. The seamstress smoothed her worn dress and descended the narrow stairs. Mrs. Blackwood stood beside bolts of fine silk, her perfectly arranged hair catching the light from the window. She examined Monet with the same expression she might use for livestock at auction. "The stitching on my blue dress was crooked," Adelaide said. "Redo it." Monet had spent 12 hours on that dress. Every stitch was perfect. She knew because she had checked twice. "Yes, ma'am. And clean this shop properly. The dust shows your true nature." Adelaide swept out, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and casual cruelty. Monet returned to her room and stared at the half-finished mending. Her true nature. A woman who once taught children their letters, now reduced to grateful servitude. The mysterious letters had started arriving 2 weeks ago. Legal documents with Denver postmarks that she quickly hid whenever someone entered the shop. She dared not open them where prying eyes might see. Tonight, when the shop closed and the town settled into sleep, she would finally read what they contained. Miles outside town, Silas Fournier guided his cattle toward fresh grazing land. The late afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold and red. His ranch sat on the border between civilization and wilderness, exactly where he wanted it. He had earned his solitude through violence. 3 years ago, his reputation with a gun had made men step aside when he walked down a street. Now he preferred the company of cattle and silence. They asked nothing of his past and expected nothing of his future. The abandoned property adjacent to his ranch had shown signs of recent visitors, footprints in the dust, disturbed vegetation where someone had examined old fence posts. He made a mental note to investigate after the cattle were settled. Back in town, the evening brought no relief from the heat. Monet finished her work and locked the shop door. Upstairs, she lit a single candle and retrieved the hidden letters from beneath her mattress. The first envelope bore the seal of a Denver law firm. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax. Her Aunt Margaret was dead. The woman who had raised her mother, who had moved north years before the war, had left everything to her only living relative. Monet read the inventory twice before the words fully registered. Property deeds, a substantial bank account, and most shocking of all, documentation proving she owned half the land that Jeremiah Blackwood claimed as his family's legacy. The second letter contained copies of original territorial filings, signatures that proved her grandfather had been cheated out of his rightful claims decades ago. The Blackwood fortune was built on stolen land. Monet blew out the candle and sat in darkness. She owned property. She owned the very ground beneath Jeremiah Blackwood's bank. She could walk away from this town tonight and never look back, or she could stay and fight. The next morning brought news of a town meeting. Jeremiah Blackwood stood before the assembled citizens and spoke of progress and prosperity. The railroad was coming to Crimson Hollow. Property values would soar. The Blackwood Bank would help families invest wisely in the future. Monet served coffee and listened from the back of the room. Her inheritance papers were hidden beneath her apron. As she refilled cups and cleared plates, fragments of conversation reached her ears. "The Morrison family sold their ranch for half its value," someone whispered. "Blackwood convinced them the railroad would miss their land entirely. Now he's selling plots up north at triple the price." When the meeting ended and the crowd dispersed, Monet began collecting dishes from the abandoned tables. Jeremiah Blackwood remained behind with two other men she recognized as his business associates. They spoke in low tones near the front of the room. "The territorial survey confirms it," Jeremiah was saying. "The railroad will pass 20 miles north of here. These fools will never know the difference." "What about the Morrison documents?" asked one associate. "Forged, like all the others. By the time anyone discovers the truth, we'll own half the territory." Monet froze beside a table loaded with empty cups. Jeremiah's voice carried clearly in the nearly empty room. "The Federal Land Office has no record of the original claims. We destroyed those years ago." A cup slipped from Monet's hands and shattered against the floor. The sharp sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Jeremiah Blackwood's face shifted from surprise to calculation. He crossed the room with deliberate steps while his associates watched from behind. "You heard nothing," he said quietly. "You understand nothing, and you will remember nothing." Monet nodded quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Because if you do remember," Jeremiah continued, "you'll discover that debts can grow larger and forgiveness can disappear entirely." She gathered the broken pieces with shaking hands. The men left without another word. But Monet Rivers now possessed 2 forms of dangerous knowledge. Her inheritance could free her from debt and expose decades of fraud. The question was whether she had the courage to use it. The threats began the next morning. Monet's sewing machine jammed repeatedly. Threads snapped without cause. The shopkeeper informed her that several customers had canceled their orders without explanation. Adelaide Blackwood appeared at noon with a smile that carried no warmth. "Such unfortunate accidents lately," she observed, examining a bolt of fabric. "Perhaps you're becoming careless in your work." Monet kept her eyes down and continued mending. The inheritance papers remained hidden beneath her mattress, but their weight pressed against her thoughts constantly. "My husband mentioned you were quite attentive at the town meeting," Adelaide continued. "He appreciates loyalty in those who serve our family." The word "serve" hung in the air like a threat. Monet understood its meaning perfectly. That evening, she walked to the abandoned property mentioned in her inheritance. The land stretched for acres beyond the town limits, adjoining a working cattle ranch. In the fading light, she could make out the foundation of an old house and the remains of fence posts that marked property boundaries. This was hers. All of it. The papers in her room proved it beyond doubt. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind her. Monet spun around to face a tall man with weathered features and careful eyes. His hand rested near his side in a gesture that spoke of long habit. "This is private property," Silas Fournier said. "I know." Monet's voice came out steadier than she felt. "It's mine." Silas studied her face in the dying light. Something in her bearing suggested she wasn't lying. He had heard stories about the seamstress who worked above the general store, whispers about debts and servitude. This woman showed none of the broken spirit those stories suggested. "You're Jeremiah Blackwood's seamstress." "I pay a debt to Jeremiah Blackwood. I am no one's property." The distinction mattered. Silas recognized the difference between submission and strategy. He had learned it himself during years of careful survival. "These lands have been empty for decades," he said. The Blackwood family claims ownership. The Blackwood family claims many things. Monet reached into her bag and withdrew a folded document. This is a territorial deed filed in 1863. It shows my grandfather's original claim to this property. Silas accepted the paper and examined it by moonlight. The official seals appeared genuine. The boundaries matched the land they stood on. If authentic, this document predated any Blackwood claim by years. Where did you get this? My aunt died in Denver. She left me everything my family once owned. Including this land? Including half the land Jeremiah Blackwood calls his empire. Silas handed back the deed. He understood why she looked over her shoulder constantly. Knowledge like this could destroy the most powerful man in 3 counties. It could also get her killed. What do you plan to do? Monet stared across the property that represented both freedom and danger. I don't know. You could leave town tonight, take whatever money came with the inheritance and disappear. I could, but you won't. Would you? Silas considered the question. 3 years ago, he would have advised exactly that course of action. Survival meant avoiding unnecessary conflicts with dangerous men. But 3 years ago, he had been a different person with different regrets. Why did you come here tonight? He asked. To see what I inherited, to understand what I'm fighting for. And what did you find? Monet looked around at the empty land that could have supported a family, could have provided security and dignity, could have prevented her husband's desperate gambling and her subsequent bondage. I found something worth the risk. The Blackwoods won't let you claim this quietly. I know. Silas made a decision he hadn't planned to make. My ranch is adjacent to this property. If you need somewhere safe to plan your next move, you're welcome to use it. Why would you help me? Because I recognize courage when I see it, and because I understand what it means to want a second chance. They walked back toward town in comfortable silence. At the edge of the property line, Monet stopped. There's something else, she said. Yesterday, I overheard Jeremiah discussing business with his associates. He's been forging property documents for years, selling families worthless land while claiming it's valuable railroad property. How many families? Dozens, maybe more. The railroad isn't even coming through Crimson Hollow. Silas absorbed this information. Property fraud on that scale would constitute federal crimes. It would also explain how the Blackwood fortune had grown so dramatically in recent years. You have evidence? I have what I heard, and I have 40 years of observations about their business practices. That might not be enough for a legal challenge. Then I'll find more evidence. They reached the outskirts of town. Gas lamps flickered in scattered windows. Most honest citizens had retired for the evening. Monet prepared to return to her cramped room and sleepless planning. Don't stop, she whispered, more to herself than to Silas. What? Something my mother used to say. When things seemed impossible, she'd tell me to remember that giving up was the only real failure. Don't stop. Don't stop fighting. Don't stop hoping. Don't stop believing things can change. Silas watched her walk back toward the general store. In the morning, she would return to her sewing and her careful servitude, but she would also return to planning the downfall of the most powerful family in the territory. For the first time in years, he found himself believing that change was possible. The persecution intensified over the following week. Monet's sewing supplies disappeared from the shop. Her few remaining customers received anonymous warnings about her character. The shopkeeper informed her that complaints had been filed about her work quality. Jeremiah Blackwood made his presence felt without direct confrontation. He appeared wherever she worked, watching silently until she acknowledged his authority. The message was clear: submit completely or face escalating consequences. Monet began visiting her inherited property each evening after the shop closed. She examined old fence posts and foundation stones, documenting boundaries that matched her legal papers exactly. The land showed signs of previous habitation. Wells had been dug, crops had been planted. A family had built their future here before being driven away. On the 4th night, Silas waited for her beside the old foundation. "Jeremiah knows about your inheritance," he said without preamble. "His bank contacts in Denver reported the transfer." "How do you know?" "Because he visited my ranch yesterday. Suggested I discourage trespassers on adjacent properties." Monet felt the walls closing in. Her secret advantage had evaporated. Now Jeremiah understood exactly what threat she represented. "What did you tell him?" "That I protect my own interests. Nothing more." They walked the property boundaries while Monet explained what her aunt's papers revealed. Original survey maps that contradicted current records. Signed affidavits from witnesses who had since died under suspicious circumstances. A pattern of systematic land theft spanning 4 decades. "Your grandfather wasn't the only victim," she said. "Dozens of families lost their claims through forged transfers and intimidation." Silas recognized several names from her list. Good families who had left the territory suddenly. Men who had died in accidents after challenging Blackwood business practices. A conspiracy larger than either had initially suspected. "The railroad story is cover for the latest scheme," Monet continued. "Families are selling valuable land for nothing and buying worthless swamp for fortunes." "How do you know about the railroad route?" "I was a teacher. I know how to research. The Territorial Survey Office keeps records of all planned developments. The real route passes 20 miles north of here." Silas admired her thoroughness. Teaching frontier children required patience and systematic thinking, skills that translated perfectly to legal investigation. "What's your plan?" "Expose everything at once. Present evidence that's too overwhelming to dismiss or cover up." "That's dangerous." "Everything is dangerous now." 3 nights later, Monet discovered the frame waiting for her, a pouch of silver coins hidden beneath her mattress. Money she had never seen before placed where she would inevitably find it. The next morning, Deputy Marshal Cole arrived with an arrest warrant. Theft from the general store. Evidence discovered in her room. Witnesses prepared to testify about her desperate circumstances and declining character. Monet fled through the back entrance while Cole pounded on the front door. She ran through alleys and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where citizens might spot her. Her only destination was the abandoned property where Silas had promised sanctuary. She found him waiting with 2 saddled horses. "We need to leave," he said. "They've posted men at every road leading out of town." "I won't run. Then you'll hang. Jeremiah's not taking chances anymore." Monet clutched her bag containing all her legal documents. Running meant abandoning every family the Blackwoods had cheated. It meant letting fraud continue indefinitely. It meant choosing personal survival over justice. "Don't stop," she whispered. "What?" "My mother's words. Don't stop fighting when the fight matters most." Silas understood her decision. He had faced similar choices during his violent years. The easy path versus the right path. Survival versus principle. "Then we fight smart," he said. "My ranch house is defensible. We can plan properly there." They rode hard across open country, avoiding established trails. Silas knew every canyon and ridge from years of solitary exploration. By sunset, they reached his ranch without encountering pursuit. The house sat in a natural depression surrounded by high ground. Fresh water came from a reliable well. Supplies could last for weeks if necessary. Most importantly, it lay outside Jeremiah's immediate sphere of control. That evening, Monet spread her documents across Silas's kitchen table. Property deeds dating back to territorial establishment. Survey maps showing original land grants. Correspondence between her aunt and federal land office officials. Evidence of a conspiracy spanning generations. "My aunt spent years collecting this information," Monet said. "She knew the truth about what happened to our family. Why didn't she act on it? Because she was one woman fighting a powerful organization. She needed someone with local knowledge and community connections. Someone like you. Someone like us." Silas examined a federal survey map from 1862. It showed railroad planning that directly contradicted current Blackwood claims about route development. "This proves the railroad deception," he said. "But we need witnesses to testify about the current fraud. I know which families have been cheated recently. The Morrison family lost their ranch 3 months ago. The Hendersons sold their cattle land for railroad stock that's worthless. They'll be afraid to speak publicly. Not if they understand they're not alone. Not if they see evidence that justice is possible. Monet organized the documents into categories: land theft, railroad fraud, witness intimidation, federal mail crimes, a comprehensive case that would require federal intervention. Teaching prepared you for this, Silas observed. Teaching children requires breaking complex subjects into understandable pieces, making connections clear, showing how individual facts support larger truths. And this is the most important lesson I'll ever teach. Outside, coyotes called across the desert. Inside, two people planned the downfall of an empire built on lies. Monet worked with the focused intensity she had once brought to lesson planning. Silas contributed knowledge gained from years of territorial travel and observation. By midnight, they had identified 12 families with strong fraud claims, 6 witnesses to forged documents, 3 federal crimes with clear evidence, a case that could bring down the entire Blackwood operation if presented properly. The question remained whether they could gather testimony before Jeremiah silenced his victims permanently. The Morrison family lived in a converted wagon 20 miles from town. Their ranch house had burned down the night after they questioned Jeremiah Blackwood's land purchase terms. Official records listed the cause as accidental, but the timing suggested otherwise. Monet and Silas arrived at dawn, approaching carefully through scattered mesquite trees. Frank Morrison met them with a shotgun until Silas identified himself. Recognition brought relief, but not trust. "What do you want?" Morrison asked. Monet spread the federal survey map across a wooden crate. The document showed Morrison's original property sitting directly in the path of the real railroad route. The land Jeremiah had convinced him was worthless would become the most valuable property in the territory. "He cheated you," she said simply. Morrison studied the map with growing anger. His wife emerged from the wagon to examine the evidence. Their 3 children watched from behind her skirts. "We signed papers," Morrison said. "Legal documents." "Forged papers," Monet replied. "I have proof that Jeremiah has been falsifying land records for decades." She showed them the comparison between original territorial filings and current county records. Names changed, boundaries shifted. Entire properties transferred through documents that had never been properly witnessed or recorded. "Why are you telling us this?" Mrs. Morrison asked. "Because you're not the only victims, and because together we can stop him." The Hendersons required more convincing. Their cattle ranch had been traded for railroad stock certificates that existed only on paper. The promised development company had no federal charter. The investment was worthless. Tom Henderson listened to Monet's explanation with the skepticism of a man who had been fooled before. But when she produced correspondence between Jeremiah and his associates discussing the Henderson deception specifically, skepticism turned to rage. "He planned this for months," Henderson said. "Studied our debt situation. Waited until we were desperate." "How many others?" his wife asked. "At least 10 families in this county alone," Monet replied. "Probably more in neighboring territories." By evening, they had visited 6 families and gathered 4 willing witnesses. Each story followed the same pattern: financial pressure applied strategically, false information about property values, forged documents that transferred ownership for far below market rates. The Webb family had lost their homestead to a mortgage that had been paid in full years earlier. The Chen family had been convinced their mining claim was exhausted when it actually contained significant silver deposits. The Reynolds family had traded fertile farmland for desert property based on fabricated geological surveys. Each family possessed pieces of evidence, correspondence from Jeremiah, contracts with suspicious witness signatures, bank records that didn't match their memories of transactions. Monet organized the evidence using skills developed through years of curriculum planning. Individual facts arranged to support larger conclusions. Timeline established to show systematic fraud. Pattern recognition that revealed the scope of conspiracy. "The railroad deception is just the latest version," she explained to Silas as they returned to his ranch. "He's been running variations of this scheme for decades. Different lies for different properties, but always the same method: Financial pressure plus false information plus forged documents. That night, they drafted a formal complaint to federal authorities. Mail fraud crossed state boundaries and required federal prosecution. Interstate railroad deception fell under federal jurisdiction. Territorial land fraud involving federal patents required federal investigation. Monet wrote with the precision she had once applied to lesson plans. Every allegation supported by specific evidence, every claim documented with witness testimony, a case constructed to withstand legal challenge. Teaching was good preparation for this, Silas observed. Fighting fraud requires the same skills as fighting ignorance: organization, evidence, and patience. And courage. Mostly patience. The next day brought disturbing news. Tom Henderson had been visited by Deputy Marshal Cole and warned about spreading false accusations. Frank Morrison had discovered strangers watching his family's temporary camp. 2 other witnesses had received anonymous threats about their safety. "Jeremiah knows what we're doing," Silas said. "Then we accelerate the timeline." They spent the day riding between scattered homesteads, gathering final witness statements and documentary evidence. Each family contributed pieces of a larger puzzle: bank records, survey maps, correspondence, contract copies. By evening, they possessed enough evidence to prove systematic fraud affecting over 30 families across multiple territories. The scope exceeded anything either had initially imagined. "This isn't just local corruption," Monet said. "It's organized crime, with protection from local law enforcement, which is why we need federal intervention." The federal marshal's office lay in the territorial capital, 3 days' ride through dangerous country. Jeremiah's influence extended across multiple counties, but federal authority superseded local corruption. They prepared for the journey by copying all essential documents. Monet sewed duplicate papers into the lining of her coat. Silas hid additional copies in his saddlebags. If one set was lost or stolen, the case could still proceed. That night, riders approached the ranch house. Monet counted at least 6 men moving carefully through the darkness. Deputy Cole's voice carried across the yard. "Come out peacefully. No one needs to get hurt." Silas checked his weapons while Monet gathered the most critical documents. They had anticipated this moment since beginning their investigation. "The back window leads to the canyon," Silas said. "You can reach the horses without being seen." "What about you?" "I'll buy you time to escape." Monet shook her head. "We go together or not at all." "That's not practical." "Don't stop," she said. "Remember, we don't stop fighting. We don't stop believing. We don't abandon each other." Outside, Cole's men began surrounding the house. Inside, 2 people prepared to risk everything for justice. The federal evidence was ready. The witnesses were identified. The case was strong enough to bring down the entire conspiracy. They just had to survive the night. The standoff lasted through the night. Cole's men maintained their positions around the ranch house while Silas and Monet waited in darkness. Neither side moved to escalate the situation. At dawn, unexpected riders appeared on the horizon. Frank Morrison led a group of 12 men toward the ranch. Tom Henderson rode beside him. Other defrauded families followed behind. Cole found himself surrounded by angry citizens demanding answers. His authority to arrest Monet suddenly seemed less certain when faced with organized community opposition. "What's the charge?" Morrison called out. "Theft from the general store," Cole replied. "Based on what evidence?" "Stolen money found in her possession." "Money that was planted," Henderson added. "We know how Jeremiah operates." The crowd murmured agreement. Years of accumulated grievances against the Blackwood family had finally found collective expression. Cole's men began looking uncomfortable. They had signed up to intimidate individuals, not confront organized groups of armed citizens. Silas opened the ranch house door and stepped outside. Monet followed, carrying a leather portfolio containing their carefully organized evidence. "If you want to arrest someone," she said to Cole, "arrest Jeremiah Blackwood for 30 years of systematic fraud. That's a serious accusation, with serious evidence to support it." Monet opened the portfolio and withdrew federal survey documents. She held them high enough for everyone to see. "The railroad isn't coming through Crimson Hollow," she announced. "It never was. Jeremiah has been selling worthless land to families while buying their valuable property for nothing." Morrison stepped forward. "Show them the proof." Monet spread the territorial survey map across a makeshift table formed by saddle blankets. The official route passed 20 miles north of town. Every family present had been lied to about railroad development. "This map is dated 6 months ago," she continued. "Jeremiah knew the truth when he convinced you to sell your ranches." The crowd pressed closer to examine the evidence. Angry voices rose as people recognized the scope of deception. Henderson produced his worthless stock certificates. Morrison showed his forged land transfer documents. "How many families?" someone called out. "Over 30 that we've documented," Monet replied. "Probably more across the territory." Cole attempted to reassert authority. "None of this changes the theft charge." "What theft?" Morrison demanded. "Money planted to frame her?" "Jeremiah's standard method for silencing inconvenient witnesses," Henderson added. The crowd's mood grew increasingly hostile toward Cole and his men. They represented local authority that had protected Blackwood crimes for years. Authority that had allowed systematic fraud to continue unchallenged. Monet sensed the moment to press their advantage. She withdrew additional documents from the portfolio: bank correspondence, forged signatures, federal land patents that contradicted current ownership records. "Jeremiah Blackwood has committed federal crimes," she stated clearly. "Mail fraud, interstate conspiracy, falsification of territorial documents." "You have no authority to make such determinations," Cole said, "but federal marshals do." Monet produced copies of their formal complaint to territorial authorities, multiple witness statements, documentary evidence of systematic fraud, a legal case prepared with prosecutorial thoroughness. "This complaint will be filed in the territorial capital," she continued. "Federal investigation will follow within days." The implications were clear. Jeremiah's empire would collapse under federal scrutiny. Local protection would prove inadequate against territorial authority. Cole recognized his impossible position. He could arrest Monet and face immediate confrontation with armed citizens, or he could withdraw and explain his failure to Jeremiah Blackwood. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Yes, it is," Morrison replied. "We're done being afraid." Cole and his men withdrew toward town. The gathered families remained to hear complete details about the evidence Monet and Silas had assembled. For 2 hours, Monet explained the legal framework of their case: federal jurisdiction over territorial land fraud, interstate mail fraud penalties, witness protection under federal law. A comprehensive prosecution that would ensure justice for all victims. "What do you need from us?" Henderson asked. "Formal statements about your individual cases, documentation of losses, willingness to testify before federal investigators. And if Jeremiah retaliates before the federals arrive, we protect each other," Morrison said, "like we should have done years ago." The community that had been divided and intimidated through fear began organizing for mutual defense. Men volunteered to guard threatened families. Women arranged communication networks to spread warnings quickly. Monet watched the transformation with satisfaction. Teaching had prepared her to recognize learning when it occurred. These people were finally understanding their collective strength. "Don't stop," she said to the assembled group. "Don't stop supporting each other. Don't stop demanding justice. Don't stop believing things can change." The phrase that had begun as personal encouragement became their rallying cry. Henderson repeated it when organizing patrols. Morrison used it when coordinating witness protection. Other families adopted it when facing continued intimidation. By afternoon, a delegation was prepared to ride to the territorial capital. Morrison, Henderson, and 4 other men would escort Monet and Silas to federal authorities. Safety in numbers and shared determination. 3 days to reach the capital, Silas said. 3 days for Jeremiah to realize his empire is finished. "He'll try to destroy evidence," Monet replied. "Intimidate remaining witnesses. Maybe flee the territory entirely. Then we'd better ride fast," The group departed at sunset, following trails that avoided main roads and known Blackwood surveillance points. Behind them, armed families maintained defensive positions around scattered homesteads. Ahead lay federal justice and the end of systematic fraud that had plagued the territory for decades. The case was strong. The evidence was overwhelming. The community was finally united. Jeremiah Blackwood's reign of corruption was about to end. The federal marshals arrived in Crimson Hollow 6 weeks later. 3 men in dark suits who carried the full authority of territorial law. They found Jeremiah Blackwood's bank closed and his family fled to parts unknown. Deputy Marshal Cole faced immediate arrest for conspiracy and evidence tampering. His jail keys were handed to honest citizens who had volunteered to maintain order until proper authority could be established. The investigation proceeded with methodical efficiency. Federal agents examined every document Monet had organized. They interviewed every witness she had identified. They traced property transfers back through decades of systematic fraud. The scope exceeded even Monet's careful research. Blackwood's schemes had operated across 4 territories. Over 200 families had been defrauded. The stolen wealth amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars in current value. Properties were restored to rightful owners through federal court orders. Forged documents were voided. Legitimate claims were validated against territorial records. Justice moved slowly but comprehensively. Frank Morrison reclaimed his ranch and discovered oil deposits that made his family wealthy beyond imagination. Tom Henderson's original cattle land proved perfect for the railroad route, earning him substantial compensation from development companies. The Chen family's mining claim yielded silver ore worth 10 times what they had been paid for it. The Webb family's homestead became valuable town property, as Crimson Hollow grew into a legitimate commercial center. Every family received compensation for years of losses. Federal investigators ensured no victim was forgotten or overlooked. Monet used her inheritance to purchase additional land adjacent to her grandfather's original claim. The combined property provided perfect space for the school she had always dreamed of building. Construction began in early spring. Local families contributed labor and materials in gratitude for her courage. The schoolhouse rose quickly under community effort and shared determination. By autumn, 30 children attended classes in the new building. Monet taught reading, writing, mathematics, and most importantly, civic responsibility. Her curriculum included lessons about legal rights, property law, and community organization. Never again would ignorance make fraud possible in her territory. Silas found purpose in supporting the educational mission. His knowledge of territorial law helped develop adult education programs. His reputation ensured that traveling families felt safe visiting the school. He taught practical skills like surveying, animal husbandry, and business accounting. Former victims of fraud learned to protect themselves through knowledge and organization. The partnership between teacher and rancher created something neither could have accomplished alone. Education and protection working together to build genuine community strength. Evening classes met twice weekly in the schoolhouse. Men and women learned to read legal documents. They practiced basic accounting to track business transactions. They studied territorial law to understand their rights as citizens. "Don't stop learning," Monet would tell her adult students. "Knowledge is the best protection against deception." The phrase had evolved from desperate whisper to community motto. It appeared painted above the schoolhouse door. Children recited it during morning assemblies. Adults used it when facing difficult decisions. 1 year after the federal investigation concluded, Crimson Hollow had transformed completely. Honest businesses replaced corrupt enterprises. Fair elections selected legitimate leadership. Community cooperation had replaced fear and intimidation. The railroad arrived exactly where federal surveys had predicted. Property values rose based on legitimate development rather than fraudulent speculation. Families prospered through honest work and fair dealing. Monet stood in her schoolhouse watching children practice their letters. Some were sons and daughters of families the Blackwoods had cheated. Others came from honest ranchers who had always worked hard for modest success. All of them would grow up understanding their rights and responsibilities as citizens. They would know how to recognize fraud and organize against corruption. They would build better communities through education and cooperation. Silas entered carrying supplies for the afternoon woodworking class. His students would learn practical skills along with academic subjects. The combination prepared them for successful adult lives. The Henderson boy shows real talent for mathematics, Monet observed. His father wants him to understand business properly. No more trusting others with family finances. Smart approach. They worked together, preparing lesson materials while children played outside during recess. The sound of laughter filled spaces that had once echoed with fear and desperation. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had taken the inheritance money and left?" Silas asked. "Sometimes. But then I see what we built here and know we made the right choice, even with all the danger. Especially because of the danger. Easy choices don't usually lead to meaningful changes." Through the window, they could see the town growing steadily around the school. New businesses, new families, new opportunities created through honest effort and community support. The Blackwood Bank had become a general store run by the Morrison family. The old Blackwood mansion housed a territorial courthouse where fair trials replaced corrupt proceedings. Even the physical landscape reflected moral transformation. As evening approached, adult students began arriving for their weekly classes. Former fraud victims now teaching newer arrivals about legal rights and business practices. Knowledge spreading through community networks built on trust and mutual support. Monet rang the school bell to signal the beginning of evening session. The sound carried across the valley, calling people to education and empowerment. "Don't stop believing in tomorrow," she said to her assembled students. "Don't stop working for justice. Don't stop building something worth keeping." Outside, the Arizona sunset painted the desert in brilliant colors. Inside, two former strangers who had found courage in each other continued the work of building genuine community. Some stories end with justice served. The best stories end with wisdom shared and hope renewed for future generations. The whispered plea that had once begged for help had become a community creed of determination and mutual support.